Frank Sinatra approached the restaurant's heavy oak doors, the brass handle cold against his palm. L'Audimaître nodded with practiced reverence as Frank stepped inside, but something in the man's eyes flickered. A warning. A fear. The kind of look that said tonight was different from all the other nights Frank had dined here. The restaurant fell silent the moment he entered. Not the usual hush of recognition, but something deeper, something that made the crystal glasses tremble on white tablecloths. The waiter, who usually rushed to greet him, stayed frozen by the kitchen doors, his face pale as winter. Frank paused in the entrance, letting his eyes adjust to the dim lighting. 23 years in the spotlight had taught him to read rooms like sheet music. Tonight, this room was playing in a minor key. The hostess approached with careful steps, her smile too bright, her hands shaking as she reached for the reservation book. "Mr. Sinatra, your usual table is," but she stopped mid-sentence as her gaze drifted to something behind Frank's shoulder. Her face went white. Frank turned slowly. Through the restaurant's front window, he could see his car parked under the streetlight exactly where his driver had left it. But now there was another car beside it, a black Cadillac with tinted windows. 3 men in dark suits stood near the vehicles, not talking, not smoking, just waiting, watching. The hostess cleared her throat nervously. Perhaps you'd prefer the private dining room tonight, Mr. Sinatra?" But Frank had already seen what he needed to see. In the reflection of the window glass, he caught sight of the restaurant's back section. His usual table, the one he'd requested specifically because it offered clear sightlines to both entrances and kept his back to a solid wall. Someone was already sitting there. Not just anyone. Mickey Cohen's nephew, Tony. The kid who'd been making noise about territory and respect and old debts that needed settling. The kid who thought Frank's connections made him untouchable. The kid who was about to learn that some lessons come with permanent consequences. Frank straightened his tie and smiled at the hostess. "Actually, I think I'll take my regular table." The walk across the restaurant felt longer than any stage Frank had ever crossed. Each step drew attention from the other diners, but not the usual kind. These weren't the appreciative glances of fans recognizing a celebrity. These were the careful, sideways looks people give when they sense danger approaching. The pianist in the corner had stopped playing mid-song. The waiters found sudden urgent tasks that kept them near the kitchen doors. Even the bartender had stepped away from his station, leaving a half-poured martini abandoned on the mahogany surface. Tony looked up as Frank approached, his young face trying to project confidence his posture couldn't support. The kid was nervous. Good. Nervous people made mistakes, and Frank was counting on it. "Mr. Sinatra," Tony said, rising from the chair. "I was hoping we could have a conversation." Frank pulled out his own chair and sat down without invitation. The table between them suddenly felt smaller than it had during all his previous visits. "I'm listening." But Tony's eyes darted to the front entrance, then to the kitchen doors, then back to the window where the men in suits remained visible under the streetlight. Whatever he'd planned to say was getting caught in his throat. Frank ordered his usual veal piccata, side of pasta, dry martini with 3 olives. He spoke to the waiter without breaking eye contact with Tony, his voice carrying just enough volume for nearby tables to hear. Normal, routine. Nothing unusual about Frank Sinatra having dinner on a Tuesday evening. Except everything was unusual. The waiter's hand shook as he wrote down the order. Tony kept glancing at a folded piece of paper beside his untouched water glass, and somewhere in the kitchen, Frank could hear muffled voices speaking in rapid Italian. "You know why I'm here," Tony said finally. Frank tasted his martini. "Perfect. As always. Actually, I don't. Why don't you enlighten me?" The kid reached for the folded paper, then thought better of it. His uncle had obviously coached him for this conversation, but Mickey Cohen's lessons had a way of evaporating when faced with Frank Sinatra's complete calm. "There's been talk," Tony said, "about certain arrangements, certain understandings that might need to be reconsidered." Frank cut into his veal with surgical precision. "What kind of arrangements?" And that's when Tony made his first mistake. He looked directly at the paper beside his glass, just for a second, but long enough for Frank to understand that whatever was written there contained the real message, the real threat. "The kind that involve percentages," Tony said. "The kind that involve recognition of authority." Frank chewed slowly, letting the silence stretch. In his peripheral vision, he could see other diners beginning to leave. Not hurrying, not panicking, but finding reasons to end their meals early. The restaurant was emptying itself of witnesses. "Tony," Frank said finally, his voice soft enough that the kid had to lean forward to hear it. "Do you know what the difference is between respect and fear?" The young man's confidence flickered. This wasn't the conversation he'd prepared for. "Respect," Frank continued, "is something you earn. Fear is something you give." He took another sip of his martini. "Right now, you're giving me a lot of fear." Tony's hand moved toward the folded paper again. This time he picked it up. Frank watched the kid's face as he unfolded whatever message Mickey Cohen had crafted for this moment. Watched the color drain from Tony's cheeks. Watched his fingers begin to tremble. "What does it say?" Frank asked. Tony's voice came out as barely a whisper. It says to show you the photographs." The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Even the kitchen sounds had stopped. Frank could hear his own heartbeat, steady and slow, while Tony's breathing grew shallow and quick. "What photographs?" Tony reached into his jacket pocket with movements that looked like they required enormous effort. His hand emerged holding a manila envelope, sealed and unmarked. Frank made no move to take it. "You open it." The kid's hands shook as he broke the seal. Frank watched Tony's face more carefully than he'd ever studied any audience. Watched the moment recognition hit. Watched understanding bloom into pure terror. Tony dropped the envelope like it had burst into flames. Photographs scattered across the white tablecloth between their plates. Black and white images that caught the light from the candle burning in its crystal holder. Frank leaned back in his chair without looking down. "Are they what I think they are?" Tony couldn't speak, could barely breathe, just nodded. "And your uncle thinks these give him leverage?" Another nod. Frank smiled. Oh, the charming smile he wore on stage or in films. Something colder, something that belonged in rooms where different kinds of business got conducted. "Tony," he said quietly, "I want you to pick up those photographs." The kid's hands moved like he was underwater, gathering the images with desperate speed, trying not to look at them again. But Frank could see in his face that he'd already seen enough. "Now I want you to put them back in the envelope." Tony's fingers fumbled with the manila paper, his coordination destroyed by whatever those pictures contained. "Good," Frank said. "Now here's what you're going to do. You're going to walk out of this restaurant. You're going to get in whichever car brought you here, and you're going to drive back to your uncle. You're going to tell him that Frank Sinatra enjoyed his veal piccata. You're going to tell him that the service was excellent, as always, and you're going to tell him that I said thank you for the photographs." Tony stared at him in confusion. "Thank you?" "Because," Frank said, his voice now carrying the full weight of decades in the entertainment business, decades of learning how power really worked. "Your uncle just showed me exactly how desperate he's become. A man who has to threaten Frank Sinatra with photographs is a man who has already lost." The kid started to stand, but Frank held up one finger. "One more thing, Tony. When you tell your uncle that story, you make sure he understands something. Those photographs? They prove I was somewhere I shouldn't have been, but they also prove he was somewhere he shouldn't have been. The man with the camera? He works for people your uncle doesn't want to disappoint." Tony's face went even paler. "What people?" "The kind who don't send nephews to handle their business." Frank returned to his veal as if the conversation had been about the weather, cut another precise piece, chewed thoughtfully, let Tony stand there processing the implications of what he'd just learned. When Frank looked up again, his expression was almost fatherly. 24. Same age I was when I first came to California. You know what I learned that first year? The kid shook his head. "I learned that the most dangerous man in any room is the one who doesn't need to prove how dangerous he is." Frank gestured toward the envelope in Tony's hands. "Your uncle is trying very hard to prove something. That should worry you." Tony finally found his voice. "What? What should I tell him?" "Tell him Frank Sinatra says hello. Tell him I remember our arrangement. Tell him nothing has changed." Frank smiled again, and this time it carried genuine warmth. "And tell him I'll be singing at the Sands next month. Compass tickets for the family as always." The young man stood there for another moment, clearly struggling to understand how a threat had turned into an invitation. But Frank had already dismissed him, turning his attention back to his meal. Tony walked toward the exit with unsteady steps, the envelope clutched against his chest. Frank watched his reflection in the window glass, saw him approach the men by the cars, saw their brief conversation, saw Tony get into the passenger seat of the Cadillac. The cars pulled away into the night, their taillights disappearing around the corner. The restaurant began to breathe again. Frank finished his veal in peaceful silence. The waiter, emboldened by the departure of the threatening presence, approached cautiously. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Sinatra?" "Just the check." But as the waiter turned to leave, Frank called him back. "Actually, there is one more thing." The man froze, uncertainty written across his face. "Call Mickey Cohen's office tomorrow morning," Frank said. "Tell them Frank Sinatra would like to schedule lunch, just the two of us, somewhere quiet." The waiter nodded quickly and hurried away, probably wondering if he'd just been made an accomplice to something he didn't want to understand. Frank sat back in his chair and lit a cigarette, letting the smoke curl toward the ceiling. The restaurant was returning to its normal rhythm now. Other diners were coming back from wherever they'd found excuses to go. The pianist had resumed his gentle background melodies. But Frank's mind was racing through calculations that had nothing to do with music. Mickey Cohen had photographs. That meant someone with a camera had been watching. That meant someone with authority had ordered the watching. That meant the web of relationships that kept Frank's world stable was more complicated than even he had realized. The photographs themselves weren't the problem. Frank had been in compromising situations before, had navigated scandals that would have destroyed smaller men. The problem was timing. The problem was who else might have copies. The problem was what Mickey Cohen thought those images could accomplish. Frank paid his check and left his usual generous tip. He walked to the front of the restaurant with the same measured pace he'd used entering, acknowledging the maître's farewell with a slight nod. Outside, his driver waited by the car, reading a newspaper under the streetlight. Frank approached without urgency, giving himself time to scan the street for any signs that Tony's departure had been temporary. "Evening, Mr. Sinatra," the driver said, folding his paper. "How was dinner?" "Educational," Frank replied, settling into the back seat. "Take me home, but not the direct route. I want to see the city tonight." As they drove through the neon-lit streets, Frank watched the passing lights and thought about photographs and leverage and the delicate balance of power that governed his world. Mickey Cohen had tried to play a card tonight, but he'd played it through his nephew. That meant he wasn't confident enough to handle the conversation himself. That meant Frank still held the stronger position, but it also meant the game was changing. Someone was taking pictures, someone was watching, someone was keeping score in ways that made Frank's traditional advantages less certain. The car passed through the theater district, where marquees advertised the latest films and stage shows. Frank's name wasn't on any of them tonight, but it would be again soon.
It always was.
That kind of visibility was his greatest asset, and his most dangerous vulnerability. His driver turned onto a quieter street, one lined with expensive homes behind gates and walls. This was where people like Frank came to escape the spotlight, to pretend that fame was something they could set aside like a costume. But tonight Frank understood more clearly than ever that there was no escape. The spotlight followed you everywhere. The only choice was whether you controlled it or it controlled you. "Actually," Frank said, leaning forward toward the driver, "change of plans, take me to the studio. I want to make a phone call." The driver adjusted course without question. They pulled into the parking lot of the recording studio where Frank had spent countless hours perfecting his sound, his image, his carefully crafted public persona. Inside, the building was dark, except for security lighting. Frank used his key to enter, walking through familiar hallways toward the office where he kept his private telephone, the one with the unlisted number, the one connected to conversations that never appeared in any official records. Frank dialed from memory, a number he hadn't called in months but would never forget. It rang 3 times before a voice answered. "It's Frank," he said without preamble. "I need to ask you about some photographs." The voice on the other end was quiet for a long moment. "What kind of photographs?" "The kind that Mickey Cohen's nephew just showed me over dinner. The kind that suggests someone's been paying very close attention to my business." Another pause. Longer this time. "Where are you?" "The studio." "Stay there. I'll be over in 20 minutes. Frank hung up and leaned back in his chair, staring at the gold records on the wall. Each one represented months of work, weeks in studios like this one, hours of perfecting every note and phrase until they became the sounds that defined an era. But none of that mattered if someone with a camera had been documenting the other side of Frank Sinatra's life, the side that existed in shadows and back rooms and conversations that happened after the recording sessions ended. 18 minutes later, Frank heard a car in the parking lot. then footsteps in the hallway, then a gentle knock on the office door. "It's open." The man who entered was older than Frank, better dressed, and carried himself with the kind of authority that came from decades of making decisions that affected other people's lives. His name was Joseph, though Frank had never learned his last name and had never asked for it. "Tell me about the photographs," Joseph said, taking the chair across from Frank's desk. Frank described the evening in detail. Tony's nervousness, the envelope, the kid's terrified reaction to whatever images it contained. Joseph listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing. "And you didn't look at them yourself?" "Didn't need to. The kid's reaction told me everything." Joseph nodded slowly. "That was smart. Sometimes the less you know, the better your position. But you know what they are." "I know what they might be. The question is whether Mickey Cohen understands what he's playing with." Frank leaned forward. "Explain." "There are photographs, Frank. That's true, but they're not Mickey's photographs. They're someone else's photographs. Mickey somehow acquired copies, probably through channels that put him in more danger than they put you." The office fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. "How much danger?" Frank asked. "The kind where people disappear. The kind where Mickey Cohen might find himself explaining to very serious people how he came to possess images that were never meant to be seen by anyone except the people who took them." Frank stubbed out his cigarette in the crystal ashtray on his desk. "You were in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people. But you're Frank Sinatra.
Ick.
Your presence anywhere can be explained as business, entertainment business, the kind that requires unusual meetings with unusual people." Joseph stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where both their cars sat under the security lights. "But here's what Mickey doesn't understand," he continued. "Those photographs exist because someone wanted them to exist. Someone planned for them to be taken. Someone who's playing a much longer game than Mickey Cohen can even imagine." Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "What kind of game?" "The kind where Frank Sinatra's reputation and Mickey Cohen's ambition are just pieces on a board. The kind where the real players are people whose names never appear in newspapers and whose faces never appear in photographs." Joseph turned back from the window, his expression more serious than Frank had ever seen it. "My advice? When Mickey calls to arrange that lunch you suggested, you go. You sit down with him like old friends. You let him show you the photographs if he wants to, and you react like they're exactly what you expected to see. Because the people who actually control those images are watching to see how this plays out. If they want to know whether Mickey Cohen is someone they can work with, or someone they need to eliminate. They want to know whether Frank Sinatra is still the kind of man who can keep secrets, or the kind of man who's become a liability." Frank stood up and walked around his desk, needing to move while he processed the implications of what Joseph was telling him. "So tonight wasn't about Mickey threatening me. It was about someone else testing both of us. Now you're understanding." Frank looked at the gold records on his wall again, but they seemed different now, less like achievements and more like evidence. Evidence of a life lived in public, under constant scrutiny, where every success created new vulnerabilities. "What do you need me to do?" Joseph smiled for the first time since entering the office. "Nothing different than what you've always done. Be Frank Sinatra, sing your songs, make your movies, live your life. But remember that someone is always watching, and that sometimes the people watching you are also watching the people who think they're watching you." He walked toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "And Frank? That lunch with Mickey? Order the salmon? Mickey's favorite restaurant uses a particular supplier. The fish will be fresh, but Mickey might not be feeling well afterward." Joseph left without explaining further, his footsteps fading down the hallway until the studio returned to silence. Frank remained in his office for another hour, thinking about photographs and leverage and the invisible networks that governed his world. He thought about Tony's terrified face and Mickey Cohen's desperation and the careful words Joseph had chosen. Most of all, he thought about the difference between the Frank Sinatra the public knew and the Frank Sinatra who sat alone in recording studios at midnight, making phone calls that would never appear on any bill. The man who sang about love and loss and the dreams of ordinary people, and the man who navigated relationships with people who operated by completely different rules, in service of interests that ordinary people would never understand. Both versions were real, both were necessary, and both were constantly at risk of exposure by men like Mickey Cohen who thought they understood how power worked but had never learned the difference between holding a weapon and knowing how to use it. Frank finally locked up the studio and drove home through empty streets, past sleeping houses where families dreamed about tomorrow's ordinary concerns. He envied them their simplicity, even as he knew he could never return to it. When he reached his own house, Frank sat in his car for a few minutes before going inside, looking at the windows where his own family slept safely behind walls that money and fame and careful alliances had built. The photographs Mickey Cohen possessed were a threat, but they were also an opportunity to discover who else was playing this game, and what they really wanted from Frank Sinatra. The kid nephew had been terrified by what he'd seen in those images, but Frank had spent 23 years learning to read audiences, learning to understand what people really wanted versus what they claimed to want. Tomorrow he would call Mickey Cohen's office and arrange that lunch. He would order the salmon as Joseph had suggested, and he would find out whether Mickey Cohen was smart enough to realize he was being used or foolish enough to believe he was still in control of his own fate. But tonight, Frank Sinatra simply went inside his house, kissed his sleeping wife on the forehead, and poured himself one last drink before bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new opportunities to prove that he understood the game better than anyone else playing it. The photographs existed, that couldn't be changed, but what happened to the photographs, and to the people who thought they could use them, remained to be written. And Frank Sinatra had always been very good at writing his own story.